minutes to 8.
And this is Morning Report, and welcome to this, the third of our series of special interviews, extended interviews for the election campaign. And remember, these are also being live streamed on Facebook, YouTube and Freeview Channel 50. This morning I have with me in the Auckland studio the Labour leader Jacinda Ardern. Tēnā koe.
Morena.
Welcome, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You got the job as Labour leader in August. What job do you think you'll have in October?
1st of August, to be precise, and of course I'm campaigning to be the Prime Minister.
Does that sound a bit weird?
Oh, no, certainly you get time to climatise over the course of a campaign, but it is fair to say that had you asked me at the beginning of July whether I would be in this situation, I certainly had no expectation that I would. But the moment I took on the Labour leadership, I took it on with the absolute conviction that we had what it took to be in government and to be a good government.
My first substantial question isn't about Prime Ministership at all, but about being the Labour leader. If you are elected Prime Minister, will you use the power of that office as well as your Labour leadership to change the way that the party selects its leader?
That hasn't been something high on my agenda at all. In fact, party matters is not something that I've focused on at all in the past 4 to 5 weeks, and nor would anyone expect me to. So that's actually not even something I've even given thought to.
Do you think it's a good way to elect the leader, or do you think it needs to change?
Oh, I think probably with any organisation you evolve, but that's not something I've even really given thought to. Obviously, there are mechanisms that allowed me to be elected under some extraordinary circumstances. I'm grateful that I had the support of my caucus for that, but I'd rather talk to the party leadership about that in the future. Right now, not in my thinking.
Prime Ministers in the past have taken portfolios with them into the Cabinet. Longy had education, Clark had arts and culture, John Key had tourism. What portfolio would you take with you should you be in the position of being Prime Minister?
At the moment, I've been somewhat greedy in the fact that I do have both arts, culture and heritage. I agree with Helen's view that it's a place shaping, it's about identity setting, but I've also held on to a portfolio that really I would say is one of my motivations for being in politics, and that's children. And the view that as a measure of a society, the way that you look after your most vulnerable really does set the scene for the kind of government that you will be.
So you would be Minister for Children?
I expect, though, that one of the issues that I will have in holding that portfolio is that it is a practice-heavy portfolio as well. It does include, for instance, the old child, youth and family. So I would need to make sure that I had firm assistance.
So you might reconfigure it. Yes. That's interesting. You're saying you'd be Minister for Children in some capacity, yes, and Minister for Arts and Culture.
I'd like that. In an ideal world, that would be my hope, but I would need support to carry both those roles.
Good to get that on the record. Now, I put this question to Bill English too when we did an extended interview with him, and it's based on Jim Bolger's interview that we did with him on the ninth floor, where he said that neoliberalism had failed. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
So what elements and aspects of the neoliberal agenda would you roll back?
Yeah, certainly my view is that, New Zealand has been served well by interventionist governments. That actually it's about making sure that your market serves your people. It's a poor master but a good servant. So just generally, any expectation that we just simply allow the market to dictate the way that our outcomes for people is where I would want to make sure that we were more interventionist.
Yeah, and that sounds nice and it's general, your sentiment there.
Let me be more specific.
Well, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, we debate a lot the issue of child poverty. Child poverty is measured by a family's income levels relative to the rest of your country. Working for families is a mechanism that we have been able to use to say, actually, redistribution hasn't worked properly for too many. We need more targeted assistance. Let's get in there and see if we can lift more kids out of poverty using a measure like working for families. We actually think there's a bit further to go on that front. We know from those stats that 0 to 3-year-olds, for instance, suffer the most, and that's for obvious reasons. That's when parents are less likely to be in additional work.
Yeah, but you're zoning in on child poverty. We will talk a bit about this before 8 o'clock this morning. But in terms of the Reserve Bank Act, in terms of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, any of those things, are you going to roll any of those things back which were put in place by Roger Douglas and then Ruth Richardson?
We have said for the Reserve Bank Act in particular, and monetary policy more generally, that yes, of course, making sure that we keep inflation in check is important, but we also have goals around full employment, and that we think there's room for there to be greater representation on the board to make sure that we are representing our manufacturers.
Okay, but that's not an overhaul of the neoliberal agenda, though, is it? In any sense?
Well, for me, the neoliberal agenda, you asked specifically about those acts, and that's my answer.
Fair enough.
But for me, the neoliberal agenda is, what does it mean for people? What did it mean for people's outcomes around employment, around poverty, around their ability to get a house? And on that front, I absolutely stand by all of our commitments to actually say none of that should exist in a wealthy society. And there are mechanisms we can use that are, beyond just our economic instruments and acts to turn that around.
But I put it to you that under what I've seen, you wouldn't be turning over the neoliberal agenda at all. You'll be keeping core Crown spending at 30% of GDP, right?
That is our goal.
You will be running surpluses of $3, $4, $5, $6 billion, right?
Yep.
And yet you will still have children in poverty for at least 6 years, right? How long is it going to take you to solve child poverty in New Zealand? How long is it going to take you to solve child poverty in New Zealand?
Being fiscally responsible is not akin to a neoliberal agenda.
But here's my argument. You will have children in poverty over 6 years while you keep Crown debt at Crown core spending at 30% of GDP, while you run billions of dollars in surpluses. You will do that while you still have children in poverty.
In fact, I've stood by the fact that we are running a debt track that runs 2 years behind national. We've got an aim to get our debt down to 20% of GDP. We are running 2 years behind national in achieving that goal precisely for one of the reasons that you have raised, and that is that I refuse to have a goal that sits at the same time as the current government whilst our people are unhoused.
Okay,
so let me just finish. So one of the reasons that we are taking 2 years longer to get to that goal around debt is because of things like KiwiBuild. I want a massive building program to be underway, including the building of 1,000 state houses per annum.
And we've got questions on housing.
We've got to house our people.
And I want to...
And on when it comes to child poverty, we cancelled the tax cut so that we could pre-prioritise $700 million worth of funding into low and medium income households. So we said no to that going to the richest in order to reprioritise.
But you have said that it will take at least 6 years before you take all children out of poverty in New Zealand, right?
I've set a goal of getting for at least 100,000 out by 2020.
Yep. So that's at least 2 terms before you rid New Zealand of child poverty, right?
But that's on the income measure.
Yep. And so in the meantime, you will be running surpluses of billions of dollars and having Crown spending limited to 30% of GDP.
I don't expect the surpluses will necessarily be that high. But look,
hang on, that's interesting. You don't think they'll be as high as they are in your numbers?
Talking about on our operating allowance, we've left a buffer of about $1 billion in that first year. It's pretty. We admit that it's pretty tight.
Are you saying your surpluses will be less than they were in your numbers?
I can't anticipate. No, we've put out clearly what we expect our operating allowance will be, Guyon. But we have run it pretty tight because we are prioritising investment in kids. I just want to be clear though on the child poverty measures that we use in New Zealand, the measure that we've been talking about this morning, that's the number of kids who are living in households where families earning 50% or less of the median income. So yes, we can have an impact on that with working families, which is why we've put such a big boost in. And for children 0 to 3, where we know it's worse, that's why we said, actually, I want to put $60 a week extra into those households, $9,000 over the course of that lifetime. That's a big boost for exactly the reason you've outlined.
Okay.
But it's also about wages. So yeah, it does take a little while because it is also about the wages and lifting wages over time.
Okay, and let's lift the conversation up a little bit into more of a helicopter view. I want to talk about globalisation. Mm-hmm. Mike Moore wrote a book called Saving Globalisation. He's a former Labour Prime Minister who is still a member of the Labour Party and wants Labour to win. He's told us that. Yep. Do you believe that globalisation has been a good force for New Zealand?
I think it's been an inevitable force. As a small trading nation.
But a good force?
Oh, mixed. Mixed, no doubt mixed. And obviously we prepared ourselves in quite a jarring way for our expectations of what globalisation would bring us. But, there's no rolling back the clock. Our view is that with each of these challenges, as they come at us, we need to make sure that we're prepared. Globalisation, we probably could have done a bit more to prepare our nation for that. But the next challenge beyond globalisation, I would say, is automation, artificial intelligence. That's the next frontier for New Zealand. My concern is that unless we start preparing our workforce for that could equally be jarring. And that's why we started this big piece of work on the future of work. That is why we've committed to try and reach that aspiration of 3 years free education, because I think that's our next threat and I want to prepare for it.
So if you think that it has been something that is inevitable and you can't roll it back, I think you said, in terms of globalisation, why would you stop 30,000 people coming into New Zealand from poorer countries like India to make a better life for themselves in New Zealand?
Look, of course, every country has policies around immigration. So I don't think anyone says, look, globalisation's inevitable, let's have no management around population growth.
Can I quote Helen Clark to you on this? And she said this at the weekend. I know you're a big fan. All Western societies are becoming highly diverse societies, she said, because we are bringing in the talent and the skills. It's also the truth that if you are a wealthy Western country, which we are, you are a magnet. And countries, she went on to say, need the labour. This is the key quote. There is an incredible level of dishonesty about migration policies because advanced societies need the level of labour they're not generating themselves, and you have to be open to that flow of people. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I do agree with that.
Why would you knock 30,000 people out of the immigration system?
There's nothing there that I would disagree with. And when you look at our immigration policy, for instance, back to 2008, at that point, net migration was looking at about the 40,000 mark. Now we're at about the 70,000 mark. And look, as we've said before, if the population planning had been done so that we were able to accommodate that predominantly in Auckland, where most of that immigration is coming into, then we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But that planning didn't happen. We aren't housing everyone who calls Auckland in particular home, and we need to do something about that. Now, in part, we've looked for ways that we can try and encourage that immigration down through our regions, because we know we've got skills gaps there. And the other mechanism we've said we'd use is making sure, yes, we focus on skills and talent, because no doubt we have gaps. You just need to look at what we're staring down in terms of our construction and building needs. We have skills gaps. We've got to fill them. But there have been changes in some areas of immigration that we think could be tweaked. For instance, now if you come in and take a course, even if it's a low-level course, you get an automatic right to work for a year in New Zealand. That never used to exist. It exists now. And that's where we're seeing exploitation in our labour market.
Okay, and that's where you want to focus.
That's where we want to focus.
Okay, I want to talk about your ban on foreign buyers buying New Zealand homes. Does that include Australians?
No, because again, simple rule there. If you've got a right to live here, we're maintaining that right to own, and that's also.
So you can live in Australia, but buy a house in New Zealand.
Yes.
Under your policy.
Yep. But it's reciprocal. We're treating each other the same, and it's all about where you have a right to live and a right to buy.
But you are going to say that you would not sign the TPP for that reason, right? That you want to ban foreigners from buying houses here.
Yeah, and it's an interest test as well. Foreign speculators who don't live in New Zealand, have no interest in the New Zealand economy, who are helping heat up our housing market.
Have you looked at whether that breaches free trade agreements that we have with Korea? Because the NZIER has come out yesterday and said that it may breach free trade agreements that we have with Korea, and that those
and it has a flow-on effect for China unless we... Yeah, absolutely.
So does your policy actually breach those trade agreements?
We would need to renegotiate that free trade agreement with Korea.
So you are going to renegotiate a trade agreement with South Korea, which I believe is our sixth biggest trading partner, and have to renegotiate the China FTA as well?
No, let me be clear. Actually, renegotiation of free trade agreement is not unusual. So us going to our counterparts on this particular point would not be an unusual request, particularly given Korea has the same carve-out held for themselves. So they can restrict New Zealanders, but we never, because the New Zealand government did not seek the same carve-out for New Zealand. Now, look, Australia has that same carve-out in their agreement with Korea. So we don't anticipate that that would be a significant sticking point.
But you would need to reopen up the negotiation.
On that point, yes, we would. And the reason we'd need to do that is because if it stayed, then of course it would have a flow-on effect to our China agreement because of their preferred
So you're
nation
confident, though,
status.
it doesn't open up the renegotiation of the China FTA in that respect?
No, if we clarify that with that Korean agreement, then no, it wouldn't have a flow-on effect for China because that's about the favoured nation status.
Why don't you, I mean...
But again, Korea has that carve-out for themselves. Okay. Australia managed to do it. Our government never tried, and that's our point on the TPPA as well. They never tried to seek this carve-out. Other countries did, and the fact they didn't was wrong.
Well, the TPP, why don't you just go for stamp duties for foreign buyers instead of ruling out a free trade agreement, which includes Japan
we
and Vietnam and Australia and all these other countries that wouldn't you want to be a part of if you've said that you believe in free trade and you believe in globalisation?
Yes, certainly. It is an agreement.
Why would you forsake all that?
It is an agreement we want to be part of.
So why don't you just use a stamp duty?
But we also want to maintain our ability to legislate under our laws to protect what is an overheated housing market.
Even though the evidence shows that it's about 2% of sales go to foreigners.
Well, we don't know if that's clearly...
Will you tell me the level?
We've had everything between 3 and 13.
What is it? What is it?
Well, because the government excluded trusts, excluded anyone who bought student visas.
So you don't know, is this true? You don't know how many foreigners are buying houses in New Zealand?
I've seen estimates from between 3 and 13%.
Which do you believe?
The higher end. I don't believe 3 for a moment. Because the government excluded trusts when it did its count. It excluded people who bought on student visas, for instance. But coming back to the issue of the TPPA, yes, absolutely, it's an important agreement. Absolutely.
So you want to be part of it, and you're going to try to be part of it if you can get the carve out on...
I'm not going to reveal my hand here in our negotiations here this morning because, of course, we need to go through a negotiation.
But this is important and interesting. You are going to try to get New Zealand in the TPP, and it's public with your carve out for housing, but you still want to be in the TPP?
Oh, we want to be in there, but our housing bottom line is pretty firm for us.
Okay,
but again,
is that the only sticking point?
I'm not going to negotiate here though, because I still need to be able to have a hand that's not revealed in the process that we're about to go through. But we absolutely maintain that a ban is a much more effective way of dealing with this than a stamp duty. With the amount of capital that people are able to bring into the New Zealand market,
well, you could chuck it to your working group.
The idea that they just wouldn't just deal with it by paying more and pay the stamp duty, I don't think is going to bring down the heat in the market.
All right, fair enough. I want to talk about climate change. You've likened it to nuclear war in some ways. You've said it's the nuclear-free challenge of your generation, right? So we need to take it pretty seriously on that basis, I imagine. Will you commit to the green idea of no new deep-sea oil and gas drilling?
No, we haven't said that. Well, in part, actually, that's for us is about just transitions. And actually, as David Parker, our environment spokesperson, has pointed out, that actually some of that transition will mean moving to gas as we try and reduce down some of our emissions. In terms of oil, though, why would we be deep sea drilling for oil if we believe that climate change was akin to nuclear war? We just have to accept that, since we have consents that exist that do have a run time on them. Though. We need transitions. I'm absolutely fair on that. We need to justly transition away from those non-renewable sectors. But you're not ruling out new consents for oil drilling. I want to take advice on that when we're in office, but it is about a transition for us. So we're not going to have a jarring halt. We do need to transition out. We have set ourselves an ambitious target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and we'll be using the Carbon Commission to help us set incremental targets along the way. You've got your Carbon Commission, that's right, in the policy. What about no new coal mines? Can you commit to that? And again, it's all about transitioning out. But can you commit to no new coal mines? I don't see coal as our future. I don't. So can you commit to no new coal mines? I'm going down to Greymouth tomorrow to talk with those communities. It is about a transition for us, Guyon. But that's just words. I'm asking you. Can you commit to no new coal mines? I don't see it as our future. It's not our future. So you're making that commitment this morning? When I get in office, that's something that I'm going to make very clear. We've got to move. We've got to start moving. Let's talk more broadly about the economy.
What's the business you admire most?
Probably I admire the innovation that groups like Lanzatech, the work that we've seen even from groups like Rocket Lab, who aren't willing to see New Zealand as being limited in the scope of what they can achieve. I've also really admired the work that I've seen done by Air New Zealand in recent years as well, particularly the partnership that they've formed with their workforce to increase their productivity.
I wondered whether you might say Air New Zealand, which of course was partly privatised.
Yes,
and you marched in the streets against it.
We bought a good chunk back as well.
You marched in the street against the privatisation of
I marched in the street against asset sales because the government
just listed
campaigned
Air New Zealand
on that,
as one of your,
and we bought part of it back.
Companies.
Yeah. I don't see that as being contradictory.
Well,
we marched
is
against asset
it
sales.
well run as a partly privatised industry?
Look, it has been. As one that government is heavily involved in as well. Yes, it has been.
Would you buy back more of it?
In recent times, obviously, since that purchase took place, I might add.
Well, it was sold down after that.
Yeah. Look, if your question is, did I have a problem with the government's asset sale agenda? Yeah, I did. It returned dividends for the government. It didn't make sense.
Will you buy back any of those assets?
Oh, that's not something we've been campaigning on, no.
Why not? Just because it's too expensive, or?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to move to your tax policy. There's been a lot of focus on that, obviously, over the last couple of weeks. Would your tax changes be fiscally neutral, or would they be revenue gathering?
We have not focused on revenue gathering at all because, as I've said, I want to genuinely allow that group to do that work. We're not anticipating any revenue from that exercise.
Is that right? That's really interesting.
Well,
you're not, so any increases in tax in one area would be offset with decreases in other areas? Because that's what fiscally neutral is, effectively.
Yeah, I understood, but what I'm saying is we didn't bank on it in our fiscal plan. We haven't said we anticipate X amount of revenue from a working group. That hasn't even happened yet. So the point I'm making there is that I'm genuinely allowing that to be a process that they undertake without any expectation around revenue.
Because you don't need the revenue if your surplus track is to be taken seriously, do you?
And we haven't anticipated it. Okay. And that's in part because, look, that group may say, look, the bright line test that's in place is sufficient. They may say that. I don't want to preempt that or predetermine it. So we haven't anticipated revenue from that working group as a consequence.
You've ruled out land tax. I think we had a conversation about this.
We did.
On the family home, and you've ruled out capital gains tax on the family home. I understand this morning on an interview with Duncan Garner on TV3 you also ruled out inheritance tax.
Well, it's simply because the government's running around with large lists, making it sound like cumulatively we're announcing five different taxes.
You've allowed them to do this.
Oh, look, and I own it. Look, I own it, Guyon.
Yeah, fair enough. So let's get this clear. No inheritance tax either.
No.
Okay.
No, because again,
it's funny that this is all just dribbling out over weeks.
Well, no. Like when asked, because the point
you're
here
the one
is
who's made a lot of transparency.
Yeah. The two, and anyone who's heard me talk about the two priorities would probably have gathered that themselves. The two priorities for me have been doing everything we can to tackle the worst home ownership rates in 60 years. You know, keeping in mind in the 1970s we had amongst the best, and fairness in our taxation system. So you know, an inheritance tax. You know, is you're looking at it on the face of it. That's not obviously where we're trying to go.
So what's left for the working group then?
Oh, they can look at any number of options. That could be just tailored to the way that New Zealand's market looks and our taxation system works. But I don't want to predetermine what they come back with.
You could have just put out a few lines saying what the terms of reference were going to be.
And I've set them out consistently that fairness in our taxation system and our appalling home ownership rates is absolutely my focus. And look, you know, this has been traversed a lot in the lead up to this campaign. But I still stand by that my option either was to not talk about it and do the work in government. I didn't feel good about that. I wanted to give people fair warning that we would do this work. My second option was to simply say, whatever it generates in the next 3 years, I won't act on it. I'll take it to the next election. That didn't feel right to me either. When I know housing is such a big issue, to have someone give me a report and not do anything with it.
So that's what you want to move on. It's housing on tax you really want to move on.
Oh, And the fairness question is someone who flicks off 3 houses and makes a profit off it is not taxed in the same way someone who works a 40-hour week.
Okay. I want to move to a couple of audience questions. There's a good one here from Dylan. He's obviously thought about this from Wellington. He says, after your excellent remarks last month that no one should go to jail for smoking cannabis and that drug use should be treated as a health issue, he says Labor continues to shy away from any serious drug reform. And he ends his question saying, would you be open to a referendum on cannabis legalisation at the next election? And he does say, please don't talk about medicinal cannabis because it's a separate issue.
No, I agree, Dylan. I won't do that.
Okay. So would you go for a referendum?
I haven't thought about, he's asking for at the next election. I haven't thought about that, Dylan. But on the question of we're not talking about serious law reform, well, actually the idea of not imprisoning people for cannabis use is actually something that the Law Commission has set out a path for.
I think 7 people were in prison for cannabis use last time I looked.
Yeah, I think it's ever so slightly higher than that.
Okay, so you would change the law to ensure that couldn't happen?
Well, I think we should look at, the Law Commission has said we should move to a health-based approach, which means using a 3-tier warning system. Why aren't we debating that, actually? I think that's something that we should have a conversation about. That's giving us a road to making sure that people are accessing service rather than ending up in prison. And also our drug courts. They're doing enormously good work. They're channeling people through rehabilitation rather than jail if they opt to go through it. We only have 2 pilots and they're in Auckland. I want to see them everywhere.
Great. I want to end with coalitions. Can you guarantee that if you lead the government, then Green MPs will be cabinet ministers if they are in Parliament?
Yeah, that will all come down to what kind of agreement we would have with the parties who...
So you can't guarantee that?
At this stage, that's all about negotiations.
You can't guarantee Green cabinet ministers?
If we're in a coalition agreement, then there's an expectation.
But you can't guarantee Green cabinet ministers, can you?
I can't guarantee what the result will be,
No, but if the Greens are in Parliament, can you guarantee Green cabinet ministers if you are the Prime Minister?
I would expect if we were in coalition with parties, then there would be roles.
But you could go in with New Zealand First.
And we could go in with the Greens.
Well, do you agree with Winston Peters' claim, and I use that word deliberately, that there is a constitutional convention that the largest party gets first dibs on forming the government, or do you think that's
I would not
rubbish?
call it a constitutional convention. I would call it an expectation.
You would say it's an expectation
There has
that
been
the
in the past.
And you think that continues, that the largest party would have a...
Again, that all depends on the makeup of those additional parties.
But that's
at
the
the
expectation.
moment, yeah, I think people have a general expectation that that's what happens.
So your aim is to beat National, get higher than
that? It
that?
is, but I don't preclude our ability to form government without having the strongest percentage of party vote.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it. Labour leader Jacinda Ardern.
RNZ News at 8. Good morning, I'm Nicola Wright. The Labour Party leader Jacinda Ardern says she would also like to be Minister for Children and of Arts, Culture and Heritage if she became Prime Minister. Ms Ardern, who took over from Andrew Little less than 6 weeks ago and has since taken Labour to a lead over National in the polls. She told Morning Report that